As Rachel Parker pulled her worn-out sedan into the Crestwood Market parking lot, the sun was already sinking below the horizon, painting the sky with hues of amber and deep purple. It was 6:37 p.m., and her body felt every minute of the grueling day she'd just endured at Mayfield & Co., the advertising agency that seemed to consume more of her life than she cared to admit. Deadlines had tightened like a vice around her neck, leaving her shoulders knotted with tension and her eyes straining from hours glued to her computer screen. All she wanted now was to grab some groceries, milk, vegetables, maybe a cheap bottle of wine to soften the edges of a rough week, and head home to her tiny apartment where silence and solitude would greet her like old friends. The parking lot wasn't crowded, a small mercy she clung to. The soft flicker of the Crestwood Market sign buzzed overhead as Rachel eased her car into a spot just a few steps from the entrance. Relief trickled through her as she reached over to grab her purse from the passenger seat, her mind already half focused on her shopping list. But the relief was fleeting. Movement in her rearview mirror caught her attention. A large, dark truck had rolled to a stop just a few feet behind her, its headlights glaring like a pair of hostile eyes. Inside, a middle-aged couple simmered with frustration. The man in the driver's seat gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles blanched, while the woman next to him had already flung her door open, anger painting her face in harsh lines. Rachel's stomach twisted, a sudden chill creeping over her skin. She barely had time to process what was happening before the woman stormed toward her car, her voice shrill and furious. The woman marched over, her blonde hair swaying as she moved, eyes blazing with a fury that felt far too intense for something as trivial as a parking spot. Rachel barely managed to push her car door open before the woman's sharp voice sliced through the air. "You've got to be kidding me," she snapped, arms crossing over her chest in a gesture of pure disdain. She looked to be in her mid-50s, fit but with a certain heaviness to her stance, like someone used to getting their way. "We were waiting for that spot." Rachel's eyes widened, her heartbeat picking up speed. She glanced back at the truck, its driver now stepping out with deliberate slowness. He was tall, broad-shouldered, probably in his late 40s, and the hostility radiating off him was impossible to ignore. "I'm sorry, I didn't see you," Rachel replied, keeping her voice steady, polite. "I can move if you were here first." But her attempt at diffusing the situation only seemed to fan the flames. The man's mouth twisted into a sneer, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Of course you didn't. People like you never do." Rachel stiffened, a chill darting down her spine. "People like you." The words landed with a weight that went beyond simple irritation. She'd been here before, in boardrooms and client meetings where her ideas were dismissed before she even had a chance to speak. And yet, somehow, it always managed to catch her off guard. "Look," she began, struggling to keep her voice even. "I genuinely didn't see you. I can move." "That's not the point," the woman snapped, her arms dropping to her sides as she took another step forward. Rachel felt the first sting of panic, her senses sharpening to every detail, the couple's eyes burning holes through her, the cool evening air nipping at her skin, the few shoppers nearby who glanced their way but quickly looked away. Her mind raced. Was this really happening? The man, whose name Rachel would later learn was Greg, took a step closer, his chest puffed out like some absurd caricature of a bad action movie villain. His gaze bore into her, eyes flaring with an intensity that made her wonder if this was really about the parking spot at all. "People like you never care," Greg grumbled, his voice low and simmering. "You just take what you want and act like you're entitled to everything." Rachel's brows furrowed. Entitled? Her car was a 10-year-old Honda with a dented bumper and a check engine light that glowed like a Christmas decoration. She worked 12-hour days to afford her cramped, one-bedroom apartment on the less-than-trendy side of town. Entitled was about the last word she'd used to describe herself. "Sir, I'm not trying to cause trouble, Rachel replied, her tone firm but measured. If you'd prefer this spot, I'm happy to move. Greg scoffed, his laugh a humorless rasp that crawled under her skin. Move? That's not the point, sweetheart. The point is you people think you can just… Greg, just let it go, the woman interjected, though her own voice was anything but gentle. Rachel caught the hint of a smirk twitching at the corner of her mouth, the kind of look that made her feel like she was the punchline of a joke she wasn't in on. I don't even know what you're talking about, Rachel said, her frustration beginning to seep through her words. It's just a parking spot. But it's not, Greg snapped, his fists clenching at his sides. It's about respect. Rachel could practically feel the air thickening with their hostility. A few shoppers had stopped to watch, their eyes flickering between her and the seething couple. Like this was some free, live entertainment. To them, this was just another public meltdown, the kind of uncomfortable scene people pretend not to notice. But this wasn't entertainment for Rachel. It was something far uglier. Greg's anger seemed to grow with every word Rachel spoke. His fists clenched, and the scowl etched on his face deepened as if her very presence was an offense. He stepped forward, his bulk looming over her like a storm cloud ready to break. You don't even get it, do you? He growled, voice a harsh rasp. People like you always act like you can just waltz in and do whatever you want. Rachel opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, Greg lunged forward, grabbing her shopping cart and shoving it hard to the side. The metal screeched against the pavement, rattling noisily before crashing into a nearby curb. Her breath caught in her throat, eyes widening with shock. Hey, she shouted, instinctively taking a step back. What is wrong with you? Greg's eyes gleamed with some twisted satisfaction, his lips curling into a sneer. What's wrong with me? No, the question is, what's wrong with you? The woman, who Rachel now realized was his wife Karen, folded her arms and watched the scene unfold with an almost sick delight. Her smirk had grown sharper, like a knife glinting in the sun. Rachel's heart pounded, the thudding beat echoing in her ears. She had dealt with aggressive clients before, condescending coworkers who talked over her ideas as if her voice was some sort of white noise. But this was something else. This was pure, unfiltered rage. Greg took another step toward her, his voice dropping to a low rumble. You don't belong here. People like you never do. Rachel's stomach twisted at the venom in his words. People like you. It was an insult layered with something more, something personal, calculated, meant to make her feel small and undeserving. But she wasn't about to let him win. Back off, she said, her own voice now cold and steady. I haven't done anything to you. Greg's only response was a humorless chuckle, a sound so dark and mocking it made Rachel's skin crawl. His wife nodded approvingly, as if Greg's cruelty was some kind of twisted performance art. She was outnumbered, but she wasn't about to be bullied. Not today. Before Rachel could even think of how to respond, the situation shifted with a suddenness that rattled her bones. Greg's expression darkened, his body tensing like a predator sizing up its prey. His wife, Karen, watched with crossed arms and a smugness that only seemed to grow as her husband inched closer to Rachel. You think you can just walk away? Greg taunted, his voice so low it scraped against her nerves. You think you can just take what's ours and pretend like you're the victim here? Rachel's eyes darted around the parking lot, her instincts screaming at her to leave. But she stood her ground, her chin lifting defiantly even as her pulse raced. I didn't take anything from you, she said, her voice trembling slightly but refusing to break. It's just a parking spot. Oh, you'd like to believe that, wouldn't you? Karen chimed in, her tone dripping with contempt. You people are all the same. Always playing the poor, helpless little thing when you get called out. Rachel's chest tightened at the accusation. The words were like poison dipped in sarcasm, meant to pierce through her composure and leave her reeling. but she refused to let it work. "I'm not playing anything," Rachel shot back, her voice firmer now. "I parked my car." "That's it." Greg's nostrils flared as he took yet another step forward, now inches away from her. His fingers twitched at his sides like he was debating whether to make good on his unspoken threats. The air between them was electric, thrumming with tension and something much darker. It happened so fast, Rachel barely had time to react. Greg reached out and grabbed her arm, his grip like a steel vise clamped around her skin. Pain flared along her bicep, her eyes widening in shock. "Don't touch me." Rachel's voice tore from her throat, louder than she intended, sharp enough to slice through the chilly evening air. A few heads turned. Bystanders lingered nearby, some of them watching with wide eyes but refusing to intervene. Maybe they didn't want to get involved. Maybe they thought it was just a typical argument. But it wasn't. It was so much more than that. Rachel's entire body tensed, her muscles locked with a mixture of panic and fury. Greg's hand was still gripping her arm, his fingers digging into her skin with an arrogance that made her blood boil. How many times had she encountered this kind of entitlement? People who believed they had the right to push her around, dismiss her, make her feel small. But this was different. This was blatant, physical, and brazen enough to spark something defiant within her. "I said, don't touch me," Rachel shouted, jerking her arm free with a force that sent Greg stumbling back a step. Her own voice sounded foreign to her, powered by adrenaline and sheer frustration. Around them, the parking lot seemed to be holding its breath. Strangers stood frozen, their eyes darting between Rachel and the couple like they were witnessing some bizarre piece of street theater. No one stepped forward. No one offered help. But then, out of nowhere, a voice rang out. "Hey, back off, man." Rachel whipped her head toward the sound and spotted a young man in his early 20s jogging over from the entrance of Crestwood Market. His dark hair was tousled, a Ridgewood Market apron tied loosely around his waist. The name tag pinned to his chest read Miguel. Karen rolled her eyes dramatically, her annoyance morphing into something closer to mockery. "Oh great, another one. What, you gonna play hero now?" Miguel's expression was fierce and unyielding, his fists clenched at his sides. "I saw what you just did." And so did the cameras. Greg's eyes flickered with something close to panic, a flash of fear quickly buried under bluster. "Mind your business, kid. This is my business," Miguel shot back, his voice steady. "And if you put your hands on her again, I'm calling the cops." For the first time since this whole nightmare began, Rachel felt a sliver of hope wedge its way into her chest. Someone was standing up for her. Someone was willing to step into the mess and face down the bullies who thought they could intimidate her into silence. But she couldn't help but wonder, was it really enough to stop them? Greg's jaw tightened, his eyes locked onto Miguel with a look that could have melted steel. The young man's boldness seemed to catch him off guard, but only for a second. Greg wasn't used to being challenged, and he certainly wasn't used to being threatened by some kid half his age. "You think I'm scared of you?" Greg scoffed, his voice thick with condescension. "You've got no idea who you're dealing with." Miguel's gaze didn't waver. He took another step forward, shoulders squared, his presence surprisingly commanding for someone so young. "No, you've got no idea who you're dealing with. There's a security camera right there." He pointed to the pole just above them, where a tiny blinking red light silently witnessed the entire scene. "And I saw you grab her. Pretty sure the cops aren't going to be too happy about that." For a moment, Greg looked like he wanted to lunge at Miguel just for speaking. His fists were clenched so tightly his knuckles had turned bone white, and his breathing was shallow, angry. But something about Miguel's words, or maybe just the sheer number of eyes now watching them, seemed to sink in. Karen's smugness had faltered, her bravado shriveling up like a plant left to rot in the sun. "Greg, let's just go." "This isn't worth it," she whispered urgently, her fingers twitching nervously at her sides. "Oh, so now you want to leave?" Rachel said, her voice cracking with disbelief and simmering rage. "After everything you two just pulled?" Karen shot her a withering glare but didn't reply. Greg, on the other hand, looked like he was ready to snap. His entire frame vibrated with tension, his face a blotchy red mess of rage and frustration. "Back off, kid," Greg growled at Miguel, his tone losing its edge of confidence. Miguel didn't budge. "Last chance, man. Walk away or I call the cops. And trust me, they'll be here in less than 5 minutes." A flicker of doubt crossed Greg's face, a hesitation that made Rachel's pulse finally start to slow. The bravado had begun to crumble, exposing something weaker underneath. But just as she started to believe this nightmare might actually end, Greg opened his mouth and said something that made her stomach drop. "You think this is over?" "Think again." Greg's words hung in the air, thick and poisonous. Rachel's heartbeat thudded in her chest, her body still bracing itself for whatever Greg might try next. The man's eyes burned with the kind of fury that made her fingers tremble slightly where they clenched her purse. Miguel didn't so much as flinch. The kid had a courage Rachel could hardly believe, standing there between her and a man twice his size, holding his ground like some vigilante determined to do the right thing. "You need to leave," Miguel said, his voice like steel wrapped in calm. "Now." Greg sneered, but the bravado was slipping, his bluster starting to look more like desperation. His gaze flicked from Miguel to the people gathering around them. Curious eyes, some filled with concern, others with judgment. A few shoppers held their phones low but aimed, recording the scene in shaky videos that would no doubt be plastered across the internet by morning. "Greg, let's go," Karen snapped, her voice cracking under the pressure. The confidence she wore like a badge was now crumbling, her arms hugging her torso like she was trying to shield herself from the embarrassment of it all. "This isn't worth it," but Greg wasn't ready to let it go. His fists twitched at his sides, the conflict in his expression clear as day. His pride was on the line, and Rachel could see him wrestling with the decision to back down or double down. "Maybe you're right," Greg finally said, his words coming out like they'd been yanked from his throat. His glare shifted back to Rachel, eyes still seething with resentment. "But you should remember this. People like you always think you can get away with everything." Rachel felt the sting of his words, but she refused to show it. She met his gaze head on, her voice steady even though her hands were still shaking. "And people like you always think they can get away with anything." For a moment, it seemed like Greg might lunge at her again, but Miguel's unwavering stance kept him in check. "Get lost," Miguel said, his voice cold enough to make Greg hesitate. With one last hateful glance, Greg turned on his heel and stomped back to his truck, Karen trailing behind him, her steps hurried and stiff. But Rachel knew deep down this wasn't really over. Not yet. As Greg and Karen retreated to their truck, the weight of the encounter still clung to Rachel like a second skin. Her arm throbbed from Greg's iron grip, but the pain was nothing compared to the swirl of emotions churning inside her: anger, fear, and something she hadn't expected: resilience. Miguel remained where he was, his gaze locked on the couple until their truck roared to life and sped out of the parking lot. Only then did his shoulders relax, the tension bleeding out of his stance. "Are you okay?" he asked, his tone softening as he turned his attention back to Rachel. Rachel nodded, her voice caught somewhere between gratitude and disbelief. "I think so. I can't believe that actually happened." "Yeah, well, some people just need someone to stand up to them," Miguel said with a shrug, but there was a fire in his eyes that spoke of conviction. "Bullies like that always think they can push everyone around because most people are too scared to fight back." Rachel took a shaky breath, her mind replaying the scene over and over like a broken record. "Thank you. For stepping in, I mean, you didn't have to do that." Miguel's expression softened, a hint of a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. It was the right thing to do. And besides, nobody deserves to be treated like that. His words sank into her, wrapping around her like a lifeline. All her life, Rachel had tried to keep her head down, avoid conflict, and keep her interactions as neutral as possible. But standing there, with Miguel's quiet bravery echoing in her mind, something inside her shifted. Maybe it wasn't enough to just avoid the ugliness of the world. Maybe sometimes you had to confront it head on. Maybe that was the only way to stop it from happening again. Rachel straightened her shoulders, her voice steadying. "You're right. People like that count on everyone else staying silent." "Exactly," Miguel agreed. "But silence just gives them more power. It's like giving them permission to keep being jerks." Rachel glanced around the parking lot, her gaze landing on the small crowd of bystanders who had witnessed the entire scene. Some of them looked embarrassed, others just curious. But what struck her most was how quickly they all turned away the moment the danger seemed to pass. It was a lesson she would carry with her long after the parking lot emptied, and one she intended to remember. The flashing red and blue lights washed over the parking lot, painting the asphalt in harsh, flickering colors. Rachel stood with her arms wrapped around herself, trying to calm the tremors still buzzing beneath her skin. A police cruiser rolled to a stop, its tires crunching over loose gravel, and two officers stepped out, their faces drawn with the usual seriousness of people used to dealing with chaos. Miguel gave them a quick, no-nonsense rundown of what had happened, his words clear and calm. Rachel tried to mirror his composure, though her voice trembled slightly as she confirmed the events. "So, you're pressing charges?" the female officer asked, her gaze steady, compassionate but professional. Rachel hesitated. She had come here just to buy groceries and head home. She hadn't expected her evening to turn into a showdown of dignity versus aggression. And yet, as she glanced at Miguel, the stranger who'd stepped in without hesitation, risking his own safety to protect hers, the decision became clear. "Yes, I'm pressing charges." The officer nodded, jotting down notes. "Good. That kind of behavior can't be tolerated. We'll need your statement and a copy of the security footage. And if you need anything else, don't hesitate to reach out." Rachel thanked the officers, her gratitude sincere but tinged with exhaustion. She watched as they walked away, their voices crackling through their radios as they coordinated with the security team. Miguel let out a low whistle, shaking his head with something between admiration and disbelief. "You did the right thing. A lot of people wouldn't have." Rachel offered a weak but genuine smile. "Well, I couldn't have done it without you. Seriously, thank you. You didn't have to step in, but you did." "That means more than you know." Miguel shrugged, but his expression was sincere. "It's just basic human decency. Standing by and doing nothing? That's just not me." Rachel looked around the parking lot, her eyes lingering on the security camera that had recorded everything. "I guess people like Greg and Karen think they can just act however they want because most people are too afraid to speak up." "Yeah, but the more people speak up, the harder it is for them to get away with it." Miguel's eyes shone with determination, a passion that seemed far too deep for someone so young. Rachel nodded, her mind already racing with the lessons of the night. Standing up for herself wasn't just about courage. It was about knowing her worth, refusing to let other people define her value. "Thank you, Miguel, for everything." He grinned, a warmth lighting his features. "Anytime. And hey, if you're still shopping for groceries, maybe grab an extra pint of ice cream. You've earned it." Rachel laughed, the sound finally breaking through the lingering chill of the evening. "You know what? I just might." As she walked toward the automatic doors of Crestwood Market, the air felt a little lighter. It wasn't just the relief of knowing Greg and Karen had been held accountable. It was the knowledge that standing up for herself wasn't just a moment of bravery. It was a promise to herself that she would never let anyone make her feel small again.